On this episode of The Rise the Limit, Chapter 4, Storms Brewed, Sulfur Stewed, Fare Construed, transports us to São Miguel, where the ground itself prepares meals. We'll consider how the centuries-old practice of cooking cozido das furnas with volcanic warmth encounters the very present trials of severe weather and a child's food allergy, setting the scene for a tale of elemental forces and everyday adaptations. Wild winds, washed-out wanderings, worrisome wheezing. The island decided 3 in the morning was an excellent time for percussion practice. It started with a polite tap-tap-tapping at the door. It progressed to insistent knocking. It culminated in what sounded suspiciously like Mother Nature auditioning a battering ram against our lodging. Outside, the waves performed their best impression of a disaster movie finale, enormous and loud. Perhaps this was just standard operating procedure for São Miguel on a Sunday. Inside, the domestic drama unit was also active. My son, still recovering from whatever malady struck him after our arrival, experienced a Pringles-related sequel. The previous night's snack apparently contained hidden sunflower seeds, an ingredient the European Union doesn't deem worthy of an allergy warning. My son respectfully disagreed, primarily through his stomach lining. This episode added another layer to the health uncertainties that seemed to cling to us since landing. By lunchtime, the wind hadn't tired itself out. Stepping outside required bracing oneself. Opening the door became an impromptu resistance training exercise, the wind grabbing it with the clear intent of either removing my arm from its socket or slamming the heavy wood back into my face. Its preference remained unclear. My son, drawn by the commotion or perhaps just bored, followed me out into the gale. His phone camera chose this moment to abruptly end its functional existence. Did he drop it? Was it assaulted by airborne shrubbery? Did the temperature shock it into oblivion? The exact cause remains shrouded in windy mystery, but the gale was definitely hovering near the scene of the crime. Lunch was procured. We sampled a Portuguese sandwich variety seemingly engineered on the bold principle that enough melted cheese and grease can obscure any underlying questions about the contents. This culinary philosophy reappeared later at McDonald's, where a chicken cheeseburger arrived pre-slimed with some unidentifiable coating. My wife, ever the optimist, tried Ray, pronouncing it interesting, which is often code for, "I will not be ordering this again." The boy stuck to his guns, ordering steak. Again. Consistency, I suppose, is a virtue, even if it's a greasy, predictable one. Is the entire local culinary strategy based on cheese camouflage? Cover it in enough dairy and molten fat, and perhaps the diner won't notice what's actually underneath. The afternoon agenda involved navigating the coastal route, ostensibly for scenic photo opportunities involving damp horses and other weather-beaten sights. Rain lashed down. Waves continued their violent argument with the shore. At one point, we witnessed meteorological defiance. A waterfall, apparently fed up with the tedious business of flowing downwards, was being blown vigorously back uphill. Just another day on this dynamic, occasionally baffling volcanic island. São Miguel's silent stones, recounting rugged roads. The Atlantic was still putting on a show as we drove the coastal road from Sete Cidades toward Furnas. Having survived a night where the wind seemed intent on joining us indoors, and my son declared war on potentially seed-contaminated Pringles, watching waterfalls blow up seemed almost normal. Between dodging airborne water and contemplating the structural integrity of greasy sandwiches, we started noticing the island's other occupants, ruins, lots of them. Crumbling stone walls peeked out from behind curtains of moss, looking like forgotten Green Man garden sculptures gone feral. Apparently, people started throwing rocks together here about 5 centuries back. Portuguese settlers mostly, showing up on São Miguel to farm the volcanic soil. which sounds like trying to garden on Mount Doom, but they made a go of it. Some of their handiwork, these stone skeletons scattered along the roadside, is still here. You drive past, and they just sit there, covered in greenery, not saying much. Less whispering tales of history, more quietly composting. You get the feeling they've seen it all, from the first guys trying to figure out which end of a cow to milk, to tourists like us wondering if the rental car insurance covers acts of aggressively misplaced waterfalls. Life here wasn't just about dodging rain and deciphering menus, though. The ground itself had opinions. This island chain is basically a geological teenager, moody and prone to explosive outbursts. Back in 1522, a massive earthquake and landslide wiped Vila Franca de Campo clean off the map. Looking at some of these abandoned homesteads, half swallowed by ferns, you wonder if the owners just got tired of checking the seismic forecast before breakfast. Compared to that, my son's Pringle incident seems less catastrophic, though he might disagree. It does make you appreciate sturdy construction, or at least the wisdom of building somewhere slightly less volcanically enthusiastic. These ruins weren't always ruins. They were just Tuesday for someone, until nature reminded them who was boss. Not exactly a comforting thought when renting a holiday villa. It wasn't just the Portuguese and the volcanoes either. Flemish folks turned up in the 15th century, presumably looking for better windmills or just less rain than Flanders, though they might have been disappointed on that front. Then came the age of exploration sailors, using the Azores like a drive-through for restocking leaky ships and scurvy-ridden crews. You can almost picture them complaining about the lack of decent souvenir shops. Later still, during World War II, the British and then the Americans realized these islands were prime real estate for spotting U-boats, setting up bases that stuck around for the Cold War. So these stones might have seen everything from caravels to Cold War spies, a whole parade of history marching past while they just sat there, slowly eroding. Eventually, after Salazar's dictatorship ended in Portugal, the Azoreans got more say in running their own show in 1976. Good for them. Still, tough economics over the years meant a lot of folks left for places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, presumably trading volcanic soil for Dunkin' Donuts. As we headed towards the steaming vents of Furnas, these remnants felt less like monuments and more like footnotes, reminders that people build things, nature knocks them down, history moves on, and someone else eventually comes along to take pictures of the rubble. Like looking at Ozymandias's leftovers, if Ozymandias had farmed cows on a volcano. The Azores and Boston, a transatlantic connection. Those old stone ruins scattered along the São Miguel coast got me thinking. People clearly packed up and left over the centuries, pushed out by economics, or maybe just a profound desire for fewer volcanoes in their immediate vicinity. It wasn't quite like Ishmael signing up for a whaling voyage just to see the watery part of the world, but driven nonetheless. I learned a fun fact. A surprising number of those Azoreans weren't just sailing off into the misty Atlantic unknown, they were heading straight for the cod-scented embrace of Boston, Massachusetts. Yes, Boston. It seems the connection runs deeper than just sharing a bafflingly unpredictable weather pattern. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, when American whaling ships were the oil tankers of their day, they discovered the Azores were conveniently located and positively bursting with people who actually knew how to handle ropes and harpoons without accidentally skewering themselves or the captain. These Yankee whalers would swing by, recruit sturdy Azorean sailors, probably with promises of adventure and only a moderate chance of being stove in by a Leviathan, and haul them off to New England ports like Boston, New Bedford, and Fall River. Now, enduring a multi-year whaling voyage filled with blubber, boredom, and the constant company of unwashed shipmates might make anyone reconsider their options. So, When the contracts were up, many Azorean sailors looked around Boston, shrugged, and figured it beat chasing irritated sea mammals across the globe. They settled down, bringing their expert knowledge of boats, fishing, and probably a decent recipe for stew. This wasn't just a trickle. Between the 1860s and 1920s, it became a full-on wave. Add political shenanigans, poverty, and the occasional volcanic tantrum back home, like the Capeliños eruption on Fayal Island in 1957, and you had plenty of reasons to seek fortunes elsewhere. Boston became a major entry point, and Azorean immigrants found work in the booming fishing and factory industries, becoming as much a part of the city's fabric as triple-deckers and confusing intersections. Why Boston, though, beyond the initial whaling lure? Well, once a few Azoreans settled, more followed. Chain migration, they call it. Plus, when the Capeliños volcano decided to dramatically rearrange the landscape of Fayal in 1957, displacing thousands, the US, nudged by Massachusetts politicians, already familiar with their Azorean constituents, passed the Azorean Refugee Act of 1958. This let thousands more immigrate, many heading straight for the established communities around Boston. It's why, even today, you find such vibrant pockets of Azorean culture, particularly the Holy Ghost festivals, punctuating the Boston summer, lively affairs celebrating traditions carried across an ocean. So, there it is. A bridge built over whale oil and hardship, strengthened by volcanic eruptions and family ties. Walking around Boston, you might just be walking through a little piece of Azorean history. Driving around the Azores, you're seeing the homeland that shaped a significant part of Boston. Boston gave Azoreans a new home, and Azoreans gave Boston a distinct flavor. Harpoons and heritage, the Azores' whaling legacy. Thinking back on that deep connection between Boston and these islands, the one forged by hardy sailors and, apparently, a shared appreciation for cod, you realize it wasn't all just pleasantries and escaping volcanic unpleasantness back home. There was a grimmer, smellier industry binding them, whaling. Now, before you picture some quaint, sea shanty-filled enterprise, let's be clear. This was tough, dangerous work that fundamentally shaped the Azores for centuries. It kicked off back in the 1700s, when American whaling ships, likely smelling of stale chowder and ambition, sailed down from New England. They discovered Azorean waters were practically teeming with whales, the ocean's version of a floating oil drum. Realizing they needed skilled hands who weren't afraid of gigantic sea mammals or drowning, they started recruiting locals. Many Azoreans signed on, gaining what tourism brochures might euphemistically call invaluable experience before settling in places like Boston, as I learned earlier. By the mid-1800s, the Azoreans figured they could cut out the middleman and started their own shore-based operations, setting up shop right here, notably on Fayal Island. For generations, whaling wasn't just a job. It was the whole economy, the local culture, the reason coastal villages existed. Forget Silicon Valley. This was Blubber Valley. At its peak, around the early 1900s, there were apparently 21 different whaling stations scattered across these volcanic specks. They clung to traditional methods, rowing out in open boats like characters from a particularly damp novel, facing down creatures the size of buses armed with glorified pointy sticks. It sounds utterly terrifying, frankly. You might think, given the sheer grit involved, that this way of life would last forever. But the world, inconveniently, moves on. By the mid-20th century, folks started getting sentimental about whales, realizing they were more than just swimming sacks of lamp oil and corset boning. Demand for whale products plummeted faster than a harpooned anchor. The Azoreans, reading the room, finally called it quits. The last whale met its end here in 1987, closing a long, bloody chapter. What followed was a pivot so sharp it could give you whiplash, from hunting whales to watching them. Sea change from foes to fortune finders. Having pondered the sheer grit, the historical significance, and almost certainly the profound smelliness binding Boston and these islands through the age of whaling, it's quite something to see the modern Azorean sequel. Today, the big show isn't about rendering blubber, it's about whale-watching tours. Today, the descendants of men who rode out armed with pointy sticks now ferry tourists clutching expensive cameras. Today, they point out dorsal fins like proud curators displaying a living masterpiece, a rather neat trick of preserving the main attraction while still making a buck off it, minus the industrial quantities of gore. You don't have to squint too hard to see the leftover props from that earlier, bloodier drama, though. Old lookout towers, the vigias, still stand guard on the coastline, lonely stone sentinels scanning horizons where whales are now greeted with clicks, not harpoons. Restored whaling boats sit on shorelines, looking a bit naked without their crews and lethal implements. Museums occupy the old processing plants, places that likely once hummed with gruesome efficiency now displaying the tools of that grim trade, reminding everyone that the human-whale relationship here used to be significantly less chummy. Seeing these fragments scattered among the other ruins I'd been puzzling over felt like peeling back another layer of the island's tough make-do history, a past sitting right there with the present, solid as volcanic rock. Thinking about the day the music died for Azorean whaling sometime in 1987 when the last harpoon hit its mark is sobering. For generations, pursuing oceanic behemoths wasn't just a job, it was the island's entire GDP, their stock market, their reason for being, Blubber Valley, as I'd thought before. When international opinion shifted and demand for whale oil cratered, entire communities suddenly found their primary skill set, knowing precisely when and where a sperm whale might surface, wasn't exactly lighting up the job boards. Factories fell silent, boats gathered dust, and a whole way of life seemed ready to evaporate like whale breath on a cold morning. But the Azoreans, faced with economic oblivion, apparently subscribe to the "when life gives you lemons," find a new market for lemon-based products school of thought. By the 90s, they executed a pivot worthy of an Olympic gymnast. Those very same whalers, the ones with seawater in their veins and an uncanny knack for finding creatures the size of submerged buses, became whale-watching pioneers. Swapping harpoons for histograms, or maybe just binoculars, they leveraged that intimate knowledge of whale habits for tourism. Turns out knowing where Moby Dick hangs out is useful whether you plan to perforate him or photograph him. How do you retrain generations steeped in maritime hunting for eco-tourism? Apparently you just hand them different equipment and mention the tips are better. This wasn't just plugging a hole, it was weaving a new narrative, one where the whales were worth more alive than dead. It's the kind of turnaround that makes you wonder what other seemingly outdated skills could be repurposed. Competitive napping, perhaps? Advanced complaining? Now, someone was supposed to tell me exactly which majestic cetaceans ply these waters: sperm whales, fin whales, sei whales, maybe even the colossal blue whale depending on the season, or so the brochures vaguely hint. But honestly, the specifics got lost somewhere between the island's general aura of doing things their own way and my own distraction levels. My attention strayed, much like my son's did at one particularly dramatic overlook. We found ourselves contemplating nature's complete lack of interest in our personal safety. The Atlantic wind roared past, a bullying gale trying its best to peel us off the cliff face like old stamps. Yet, perched serenely on a low stone wall, impervious to the meteorological assault, sat a cat, just sitting there. A small, furry monument to not giving a damn, entirely unmoved by winds that threatened to send us express mail to Lisbon. My son, demonstrating a similar indifference to physics and parental sanity, saw this not as a Zen koan, but as the perfect opportunity to investigate the structural integrity of the cliff edge up close. His mother responded with a shriek that could curl milk, scrambling to retrieve the aspiring daredevil while he feigned deafness with award-winning skill. It was a moment that cried out for my mother-in-law, Mimi, whose approach to child safety generally involved a vice-like grip on whatever appendage was closest. Some might argue her methods lack nuance, but they undeniably reduce unscheduled gravitational experiments. His brief flirtation with the void certainly didn't do much for my already frayed nerves, reminding me just how thin the line between scenic beauty and potential disaster can feel out here. Vents and views, volcanic victuals and Victorian visions. Was there a less gravitationally ambitious way to spend a day in the Azores? Preferably one that didn't involve potentially retrieving my son from the bottom of a ravine? Having spent the previous afternoon convincing him that cliff edges weren't playground equipment, we set our sights on Furnas. The name sounds like it belongs on a factory chimney. But the reality involves less industry and more subterranean indigestion. Furnas is famous for its hot springs, fumaroles, and a distinct, lingering aroma, suggesting Beelzebub recently enjoyed a 3-bean salad nearby. The air, thick with sulfur, carried an implicit warning label. Contents under pressure. Also, smells terrible. Locals, equipped with olfactory systems apparently forged in volcanic fire, have leaned into the region's geothermal quirks. They cleverly exploit the Earth's natural oven, burying large pots filled with meat and vegetables, the famous cozido das furnas, into steaming vents in the ground. Hours later, dinner is served, slow-cooked by the planet itself and faintly perfumed with brimstone. We saw the designated cooking plots near the lake, mounds of dirt puffing steam like miniature volcanoes practicing for the big leagues. It looked like laundry day for mole people. While you have to admire the ingenuity of cooking your dinner with the heat source that could also potentially melt your village, we decided to pass. My stomach, still recovering from yesterday's adrenaline surge triggered by near-filial defenestration, wasn't quite ready for geothermally prepared cabbage. Decamping from the fragrant heart of town, fragrant in the way a chemistry experiment gone wrong is fragrant, we sought refuge by the lake, Lagoa das Furnas. It lay remarkably calm, a mirror reflecting the lush green hills, utterly unconcerned by the boiling sulphurous drama percolating just below ground. It's a peculiar thing to know you're standing inside a volcanic crater, especially when the crater lake looks so blissfully indifferent. We ambled along part of its edge, appreciating the distinct lack of precipitous drops. Volcanic activity is one thing, parental anxiety quite another. Dominating one shore is a building that seems to have wandered off a movie set. The Capella de Nossa Senhora das Vitórias, a neo-Gothic chapel looking Ruritanian enough to host a vampire wedding. Turns out it was built in the 19th century by a wealthy landowner, José do Canto, as a rather elaborate final resting place for his wife. A grand gesture undoubtedly, though perhaps a touch excessive. Most men buy flowers. José opted for eternal lakeside property with flying buttresses. Its reflection shimmered in the still, slightly ominous water, a monument to devotion built on geologically interesting real estate. You might say that love built on unstable ground is one thing, but a chapel built on unstable ground is something else entirely. Watching the mist swirl around its pointy bits, I briefly saw it as a stand-in for 19th century Portugal itself, grand, maybe a bit gloomy and surrounded by forces it couldn't entirely control. Eventually, hunger gnawed through our appreciation of volcanic plumbing and romantic architecture. We retreated to the town proper and found a place promising local flavor. We braced ourselves for the authentic furnace experience, perhaps even the cozido we'd earlier chickened out of trying. What materialized was, well, it was sustenance. Technically, not the famed earth stew, but some other culinary endeavor that managed the impressive feat of being both utterly forgettable and vaguely disappointing. It arrived without fanfare, tasted of neutrality, and departed leaving no impression whatsoever. It was the beige paint chip of Azorean cuisine. After a day of near misses, sulphurous air, volcanic cookery, and Gothic extravagance, the meal felt like the conversational equivalent of nodding politely. The loudest sound was the scraping of forks, a dull punctuation mark on a day of otherwise remarkable geology. Parque Natural da Ribeira dos Caldeirões. The Azores, always, seem to have another water feature up their sleeve. We drove towards Nordeste, the island's northeastern corner, chasing rumours of waterfalls fueled by the relentless rain that had become our constant companion. The air itself felt waterlogged, a prelude to what awaited us at the Parque Natural da Ribeira dos Caldeirões. You could hear the place before you saw it, a growing roar that promised something more dramatic than the usual drizzle. We plunged into a green world thick with ferns and ancient laurisilva forest, the kind of subtropical woods that apparently used to cover these islands before people arrived and needed things like masts and firewood. Everything dripped. Water ran down leaves, slicked the stone paths, and tumbled over rocks, all converging towards the main event. The sound led us to the Bride's Veil waterfall, dramatically plunging into a pool below. It was impressive, the sort of natural spectacle that makes you forgive the persistent dampness clinging to your clothes. Nearby stood the old watermills, stout stone buildings from the 16th century. These weren't just decorative, they were the island's former bread-and-butter machines, grinding grain using the very water currently putting on a show, or maybe wind, because São Miguel certainly has plenty of both. Some mills were preserved like museum pieces, another housed a gift shop selling Azorean crafts, presumably not milled on site. One miller's house had wisely converted to a cafe. The smell of coffee cut through the damp, earthy air, an invitation no sane person battling jet lag and drizzle could refuse. We sat, watching the water rush past, listening to birds who seemed entirely unbothered by the weather. Exploring further meant crossing quaint stone bridges over the rushing stream, the Ribeira do Guilherme, past picnic spots that looked lovely if one enjoyed soggy sandwiches. It was undeniably beautiful, a reminder that people here had long figured out how to work with, or at least around, the island's damp abundance. Mark Twain, visiting Faial in 1867, noted the island's beauty but also called the Portuguese community slow, poor, shiftless, sleepy, and lazy. Perhaps they were just tired from hauling grain to mills like these. As we left, the sun finally poked through the clouds, a gesture that felt like a celestial apology for the preceding gloom. This meteorological miracle coincided naturally with a need for snacks. We stopped for regional goodies, sparking an intense debate over a new caramel-filled Twix variety. My wife and son declared it revolutionary. I remained a staunch traditionalist. Sacrilege tastes like nougat, apparently. We also acquired some local sardines, presumably for later contemplation. Dinner plans, however, were abruptly derailed. My son's earlier meal, despite assurances, had apparently contained traces of sesame, triggering the allergy alert system. Thus, our Azorean evening reached its zenith not with grilled limpets or volcano stew, but beneath the familiar glow of the Golden Arches. McDonald's served as the emergency ration station. I sampled a chicken bacon cheese item swimming in sauce. It was predictably mediocre. Sometimes familiarity doesn't breed contempt, just resignation. Another day of battling the elements, navigating unpredictable menus, and generally surviving the Azores wound down with the faint taste of fryer oil. So concludes Storms Brewed, Sulfur Stewed, Construed, a chapter teaching us that itineraries are often just hopeful sketches against the bolder strokes of reality, especially when tiny humans and volcanic fumes are involved. It's often then, when simply trying to keep your head above water, that the most genuine perspectives on a place or even on oneself begin to surface. As the skies clear, will mastering the Azorean surf lead to a smoother ride through the island's past, or are entirely new kinds of swells gathering strength just beyond the break?